Hello, world. I'm Jack, and welcome to English Speaking Studio.
I'm Lucy. So what are you waiting for? Let's dive in and make learning English an unforgettable journey.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into social anxiety. It's something I know a lot of you are interested in. So we're really excited to be exploring this topic. We're using the Breaking the Silence podcast as a kind of our guide. It's a really great resource that focuses on helping people understand and overcome social anxiety.
Yeah, I think it's such a common experience, and yet it's something that's often misunderstood.
Right, and that's what we're hoping to unpack today. We want to explore what social anxiety really is, how it feels, what causes it, and most importantly, how to start taking control of it.
Absolutely. We're going to be looking at things like the invisible storm analogy, which I found fascinating. And we'll also touch on how societal pressures can play a huge role in social anxiety.
I think that's so important because it's not always just an internal struggle. The outside world can really impact how we feel in social situations.
Right. And one of the key things to remember is that social anxiety is much more than just shyness.
Yeah, it's not just about disliking crowds or feeling awkward at parties. It's much deeper than that.
It's a very real and powerful fear of judgment and criticism and humiliation.
Yeah.
And that can manifest in all sorts of ways.
Like avoiding social gatherings altogether. I've definitely been there.
Yeah.
Or even struggling to speak up in everyday situations.
Right. Even something as simple as answering a question in a meeting can feel overwhelming for someone with social anxiety.
It can be so frustrating because, on the outside, you might look calm and collected, but inside, it's like a hurricane of doubt and fear.
Exactly. It's like this invisible storm raging within you.
Huh.
And the podcast really emphasizes how often, people with social anxiety feel like everyone is watching them, everyone is judging them.
Oh, I've definitely felt that way before. Like, all eyes are on you, and every little mistake you make is magnified 1,000 times over.
It's that constant feeling of being scrutinized and evaluated, which can be incredibly paralyzing.
I remember one time I was at a networking event, and I literally felt my heart pounding as I walked into the room.
Oh, I know that feeling.
My palms were sweating, and my mind was racing with all these negative thoughts. It's like my body was preparing for a fight, even though there was no real danger.
Your body's fight or flight response kicks in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to differentiate between physical danger and a perceived social threat.
Right. And the worst part is it doesn't end when you leave the situation. I mean, the overthinking afterward can be even worse.
Oh, absolutely. It's that post-event rumination.
Yeah.
You replay every interaction in your head, analyze every word you said, every look you received.
It's exhausting. And it can make you want to avoid those situations altogether in the future, which I know isn't helpful in the long run.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? But the important thing to remember is that social anxiety is a real condition. It's not just something you're making up in your head.
So where does this anxiety come from? I mean, is it something you're born with, or is it shaped by your experiences?
Well, the podcast explores the different causes, and it's really a combination of factors. Genetics definitely play a role.
Oh, so if you have a family history of anxiety, you might be more prone to developing social anxiety yourself.
It's more likely, yes.
Mhm.
And it suggests that some people might be kind of wired for a heightened sensitivity to social situations.
But it's not just about genes, right? Our experiences, especially during childhood, can also have a big impact.
Absolutely. If you've experienced things like bullying, criticism, or even neglect, especially when you're young, it can shape how you view social interactions.
It's like you start associating them with potential threat or harm, and that can make it really difficult to feel comfortable in those situations later on.
And then we have to factor in societal pressures, which everyone faces, but they can be particularly challenging for people with social anxiety.
Right. I mean, think about social media as like we're constantly bombarded with images of people being effortlessly social, confident, and successful.
And it's a very curated version of reality, isn't it? It can make anyone feel inadequate, let alone someone who's already struggling with social anxiety.
It's like a perfect storm of factors coming together. Genetics, childhood experiences, societal pressures. It's no wonder so many people feel this way. But there was one thing in the podcast that gave me a lot of hope. They shared a story about a woman who overcame her fear of public speaking.
Oh, yeah, that was a powerful story. I think for a lot of people, public speaking is like the ultimate nightmare scenario.
Yeah, it's definitely up there. So what was it about this woman's story that that stood out to you?
Well, she was terrified to speak up, even in small groups. She found it so intimidating. But she didn't let that fear control her life. She started taking small steps to challenge herself.
Like what kinds of small steps? I think that's something a lot of people struggle with. It can feel so overwhelming to even know where to begin.
Well, she joined a book club, for example.
Yeah.
And at first she just focused on listening and taking notes about what other people were saying.
Oh, that's a great idea because you're still engaging in the discussion, but you're not putting pressure on yourself to speak right away.
Exactly. And eventually she felt confident enough to start sharing her own thoughts. It shows how even seemingly small steps can lead to incredible progress over time.
It's encouraging, isn't it? Like you don't have to conquer your fears overnight. It's about finding what feels safe for you and building from there.
Absolutely. And speaking of building, what other strategies did they recommend for tackling social anxiety?
Well, they talked about therapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. I've heard of that, but I don't really know much about it.
Yeah, CBT is it's a type of therapy that focuses on well, it helps you identify and challenge the negative thoughts and beliefs that are fueling your anxiety.
So it's about changing the way you think about social situations.
Exactly. And it also involves changing your behaviors. Another strategy they discussed is exposure therapy, which I know sounds a little intimidating, but it's really about gently pushing your comfort zone.
So with exposure therapy, you're basically facing your fears head on. That sounds a bit scary, to be honest.
It can feel that way at first, but the key is to start small and gradually work your way up. It's like slowly dipping your toes into the water instead of diving headfirst into the deep end.
I like that analogy. Can you give us an example of what that gradual exposure might look like?
Sure. Let's say you're terrified of making small talk with strangers. You might start by making eye contact with a cashier at the grocery store and just saying hello.
That sounds manageable.
Right. And then you could work your way up to having a brief conversation with a coworker about the weekend, or maybe asking a question in a meeting, and eventually you might even work towards attending a social event where you can practice mingling with new people.
So it's about building up your confidence little by little.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that that progress isn't always linear. You might have good days and bad days.
That's reassuring to hear because I think sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves to be cured or to never feel anxious again.
Right, and that's just not realistic.
Yeah.
The goal is to learn how to manage your anxiety, not to eliminate it entirely.
So it's about finding ways to make it less intrusive in your life.
Precisely. And
Yeah.
alongside therapy and gradual exposure, the podcast also mentioned the importance of mindfulness.
Mindfulness. How does that fit into managing social anxiety?
Well, mindfulness is all about being present in the moment. And when you're caught up in those anxious thoughts, your mind often races with worries about the past or fears about the future.
I do that all the time.
And mindfulness helps you it helps you bring your attention back to the here and now, focusing on your breath, your senses, and your surroundings.
It's like hitting the pause button on all that mental chatter.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And when you're more present, you're less likely to get caught up in those negative thought patterns that can fuel your anxiety.
So you're not necessarily trying to get rid of the thoughts altogether, but rather to observe them without judgment.
Exactly. And speaking of judgment, I think a lot of us, myself included, can be pretty hard on ourselves, especially when it comes to social situations.
Yeah, we're often our own worst critics. We beat ourselves up for every perceived misstep.
And that's why the podcast emphasized the importance of self-compassion.
So how does practicing self-compassion, how does that actually look in the context of social anxiety?
Well, it starts with recognizing that you're human and you're going to make mistakes. Everyone does. And instead of judging yourself harshly, you try to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend.
So it's about giving yourself permission to be imperfect.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that your worth is not tied to, your social performance. You are valuable and worthy, regardless of how smoothly you navigate those situations.
I think that's such an important message, especially in today's world where there's so much pressure to be perfect.
It is. And, so far we've been talking about what someone struggling with social anxiety can do to manage their anxiety. But what about the people around them? What role can they play in supporting someone with social anxiety?
Yeah, because it can't just be up to the individual to figure everything out on their own.
Right. And the podcast uh, emphasized the importance of building a strong support system. For friends and family, it's about being patient, understanding, and truly listening.
And not just saying things like, just relax or don't worry about it.
Because those kinds of comments, even if they're well-intentioned, can actually make someone feel even more isolated and misunderstood.
So instead of dismissing their fears, it's about validating their feelings and letting them know that you hear them and you believe them.
Exactly. And it's about offering encouragement, but not pushing them to do things that they're not ready for.
What about for someone who's struggling, what advice does the podcast offer for finding support?
Well, they encourage seeking out support groups, either online or offline. Connecting with others who understand what you're going through can be incredibly powerful. It can help you feel less alone, reduce shame, and learn coping strategies from others who have walked a similar path.
It's like finding a community where you can be yourself without judgment.
Exactly. And there were a couple of common questions that came up in the podcast that I thought were really interesting.
Oh, what were those?
Well, one of the big ones was whether social anxiety can ever completely go away. It's something that a lot of people wonder about.
That makes sense. If you've been struggling with social anxiety for a long time, it can feel like it's just a part of who you are.
Right. And the podcast acknowledged that while it can significantly lessen with therapy and practice, some people they might always experience some level of anxiety in social situations.
So it's not necessarily about eliminating it entirely, but rather about learning to manage it effectively.
Precisely. And the other question was about whether avoiding social situations actually makes anxiety worse.
I'm guessing avoidance isn't the best long-term strategy.
It can. It can make things worse in the long run. While it might feel safer in the short term, it can reinforce that fear and make it even harder to face those situations in the future.
So it's about finding that balance between pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, but also honoring your limits.
Exactly. And this deep dive has been so insightful so far. We've learned so much about social anxiety, from the science behind it to the practical strategies for managing it.
It's been fascinating, but I'm curious to explore something that the podcast didn't really touch on directly.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What's on your mind?
Well, they talked a lot about the individual experience of social anxiety, which is incredibly valuable. But I think it's also important to consider the broader societal context.
You're thinking about how cultural norms and expectations might contribute to social anxiety.
Exactly. They mentioned social media and the pressure to project a perfect image, but I think there's a deeper layer to explore there. It's not just about social media. It's about the messages we receive from our families, our schools, our workplaces, and even the media about what's considered, acceptable social behavior.
That's a great point. We're often told to be outgoing, confident, and always ready to engage,
Mhm.
which can be incredibly daunting for someone who struggles with social anxiety.
I wonder if those expectations might actually exacerbate the problem, make it even worse.
I think so too. We place so much emphasis on extroversion and effortless social skills that it can make anyone who doesn't fit that mold feel like there's something wrong with them.
It's like we've created this very narrow definition of what it means to be socially successful, and anyone who falls outside those parameters is made to feel inadequate.
Absolutely. And that can create a tremendous amount of pressure, especially for young people who are still figuring out who they are and how they fit into the world.
Right, and it can make them question their worth and their ability to connect with others, which can then, contribute to social anxiety.
And this raises a really interesting question for me. If social anxiety is in part a reflection of these societal anxieties, what specific aspects of our current culture do you think are most contributing to this widespread sense of unease?
That's a great question, and it's something I'd love for all of you listening to think about as well.
It's definitely something to ponder as as we continue exploring this topic. So going back to that question, what specific parts of today's world do you think contribute to this feeling of unease and anxiety?
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure, but I think one of the biggest culprits is this constant pressure to achieve. Like we have to be doing something all the time, and not just doing it, but like being successful at it.
And we have to show everyone how successful we are too, right? Like
Yeah.
this need to present this like perfect image of ourselves to the world.
Exactly. And it's not just about, our careers or how much money we make. It extends to everything, our relationships, our appearance, even our hobbies.
Look, even when you're supposed to be relaxing and enjoying yourself, there's this pressure to be like the best at it or to, document it perfectly on social media.
It's exhausting, and I
Yeah.
think it starts so early now. I mean, think about the pressure kids are under these days. It's insane.
Well, absolutely. From a young age, they're being told to excel in school, sports, extracurricular activities, and then there's the whole social media aspect of it too.
It's like their worth is being measured in likes and followers.
Right. And that can be incredibly damaging, especially for someone who's already predisposed to social anxiety. It just amplifies those fears of not being good enough or not fitting in.
I can totally relate to that. I mean, I remember feeling so much pressure in high school to be popular and successful. It was like this constant worry about what other people thought of me.
It's almost as if you're always performing, right?
Yeah.
Trying to live up to these external expectations instead of just being yourself.
Exactly, and it's exhausting. No wonder so many people, feel stressed and anxious. It's like we've forgotten how to just be without the pressure to do or achieve.
Yeah, I think rediscovering that sense of being is so crucial, both for mitigating social anxiety on an individual level, but also on a societal level.
So how do we do that? I mean, if we want to shift away from this culture of anxiety and pressure, where do we even begin? It seems like such a daunting task.
It is daunting, but I think it starts with each of us. You know, challenging those internalized messages that tell us we're not enough, that we need to constantly strive for this unattainable perfection.
You mean like those voices in our heads that say things like, I should be more outgoing, or I'm not successful enough.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those thoughts and choosing to challenge them. It's about embracing our imperfections and celebrating our unique strengths and recognizing that vulnerability is not a weakness but a strength.
It's like we need to give ourselves permission to be human,
Hmm.
to make mistakes, and to not have it all figured out.
Yes, and it's about extending that same compassion and acceptance to others, creating spaces where people feel safe to be themselves without without judgment or pressure to conform to some arbitrary social ideal.
I love that. So it's not just about changing our own internal dialogue, but also about creating a more compassionate and accepting world around us.
Right, because the two are they're interconnected. When we start practicing self-compassion, it ripples outwards, and it influences how we treat others.
It's like a chain reaction of kindness.
Exactly, and that chain reaction has the power to really shift our culture. Little by little, towards a more compassionate and inclusive way of being.
It's a beautiful vision, and it makes me think about all those strategies we discussed earlier for managing social anxiety, like mindfulness and self-compassion.
They all seem to align with this idea of creating a kinder and more accepting world, right?
Exactly. It's like they're all different pieces of the same puzzle.
And when we put those pieces together, we start to create a world where social anxiety has less power over us. A world where we can connect with each other more authentically and support each other through those inevitable challenges.
I love that. So before I move on to part three of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. What would a world look like where vulnerability was seen as a strength, where authenticity was celebrated, and where social connection was a source of joy and support for everyone?
It's something to really ponder, isn't it? What would that world feel like, and what role could each of us play in creating it? And it's definitely a world worth striving for, right? Where vulnerability is seen as a strength and authenticity is celebrated.
Absolutely. But it also it makes me wonder, how do we get there? How do we actually start creating that world?
It's a big question, and I don't think there's any an easy answer. But I think it starts with each of us. Like
Yeah.
in our own lives, what small steps can we take to challenge those societal norms that contribute to social anxiety.
Yeah, because it can feel so overwhelming, right? Like, how can I, as one person, possibly make a difference in something as big as, societal norms?
I get that, but I think it's about focusing on what we can control.
Mm.
And one thing we can definitely control is how we treat ourselves and how we treat others.
And so, like, being more mindful of the language we use and being more intentional about creating spaces where people feel safe and accepted.
Exactly. It's about challenging those negative thoughts and beliefs
Yeah.
that tell us we're not good enough, and it's about replacing them with more compassionate and realistic ones.
It's interesting because a lot of the strategies we've talked about um, for managing social anxiety on an individual level can also be applied to creating a more compassionate world in general.
Right, like mindfulness and self-compassion. Those are not just individual practices, but they can also be ways of being in the world.
It's like the more we cultivate those qualities within ourselves, the more we can then, extend them outward to others.
And that's how we start to create that ripple effect, right? Like one act of kindness can inspire another. And those small acts can eventually lead to to bigger shifts in our culture and society.
It's like planting a seed. You might not see the results right away, but
Yeah.
but with time and care, it can grow into something beautiful and powerful.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that creating a more compassionate world is not just about fixing something that's broken. It's also about celebrating the beauty and the diversity of human experience.
I love that. So instead of trying to erase our differences or to fit everyone into some predefined mold, it's about embracing those differences and seeing them as strengths.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to emphasize that social anxiety doesn't have to define you. It's something that it's something that you can learn to manage, and there's so many resources available to help you on that journey.
Yeah, and if you're listening and you're struggling, please know that you're not alone. There are therapists, support groups, online communities. There's so many people out there who understand what you're going through and who want to help.
Remember, taking that first step toward seeking help is often the hardest part, but it's also the most courageous part.
It's true. It takes a lot of strength to acknowledge that you need support and to reach out for it.
And once you do, you open yourself up to a world of possibilities,
Mm.
and you might be surprised by how much support you find along the way.
This deep dive has been so insightful and inspiring. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the science of social anxiety to the societal factors that contribute to it, and we've even talked about the potential for creating a more compassionate world.
It's been a real pleasure exploring this topic with you, and I hope that
Yeah.
I hope that our listeners have found it helpful and empowering.
I hope so too. And before we sign off, I just want to say, to everyone listening, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and never give up on the possibility of connection and joy.
Beautifully said. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. We're all in this together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into social anxiety. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration. Until then, take care.